Welcome to another edition of Right Voices. I'm John Hart, the co-founder of C3 Solutions and the editor of our news magazine, C3. Today, we're honored to be joined by Congressman Bob Latta, who has represented Ohio's 5th Congressional District since 2007. He serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, where he chairs the subcommittee on communications and technology. He's also a member of the House Conservative Climate Caucus. Congressman, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks very much. Appreciate it.
You bet. So tell us, you're from Ohio, 5th District. Describe what that district is like, what's unique about it, and why you decided to join the Conservative Climate Caucus and how your constituents have responded to that.
Well, the 5th District's really unique in that I have the largest number of manufacturing jobs in the state. I have 86,000. And I also represent the largest farm income producing district in the state of Ohio. So I have a parallel course running of two different things that are kind of, some people wouldn't think would be in the same district. But my district goes from the Ohio-Indiana line all the way to the Cleveland suburbs. So it's goes from very urban to very, very rural. But the one thing that I tell everyone, especially, and this is why it's so important for me to be on the Energy and Commerce Committee, is that I don't say I have to have energy in my district. I have to have affordable energy. And if you don't have affordable energy, all these people that are out there in manufacturing aren't going to have a job, because everywhere I go, and I'm on the road all the time when I'm home, and you hear the same thing, is that everyone's out there exporting. But if you don't have affordable energy, we're not moving forward in this country.
Yeah, and so the Conservative Climate Caucus has made news, and it's somewhat controversial because, for decades, I'm old enough to remember the Cold War when President Reagan talked about, using the environment to contrast the superiority of the American free enterprise capitalist system with the Soviet system. And then Al Gore came along and took the issue of climate and polarized it, made it a very, very, partisan type of issue. But it's a bit of a record scratch sometimes when you put the words conservative and climate together, because people, well, what do you mean by that? So why did you join the caucus, and what does that mean? Why is it important to put those two words, climate and conservative, in the same sentence?
Well, I think it's important because, first of all, there is climate change. I think it'd be very difficult for people to go out there and say we don't have it. Our climate's constantly changing. I know, coming from Northwest Ohio, if I took you back 60 years to what the weather looked like then and where it is today, it's totally different. Our rain patterns are so much. You talk to folks in the construction industry or people who do work around homes, we get downpours now, and we have to be able to handle the water. I was a county commissioner for 6 years. I was elected twice, but Northwest Ohio is what's called the Great Black Swamp. And so my home county, 619 square miles, has the largest number of ditches in the entire state. We have 3,000 miles of ditch. If we don't have that, we can't move water. We'd be flooded. But what we've noticed over time, though, you just get these more torrential rains, and when it comes, we got to be able to handle the water, or we're not just saturated, we're flooded. So we've seen changes, but I think it's important that as we talk about as what we do as conservatives is that we've done a lot of things here in this country from 2005 to 2020, when we're reducing emissions greater than anybody else in the world. And you look what communist China and India have done, it's just the reverse. They're putting so much more out there.
Right.
But we've been able to do things in this country because of our technology, and be able to get things done and still be able to compete. It's important that we do all those things at the same time.
Yeah, and I think you've probably seen our study, the Free Economies or Clean Economies report. We did a survey of every economy in the world using the Heritage Index of Economic Freedom, and we overlaid that with the Yale Environmental Performance Index, and found that free economies are twice as clean as less free. And I had met, Congresswoman Miller Meeks on, the chair of the caucus, recently, and she identified the issue of emissions as really the key issue that separates conservatives and really progressives in Congress. Is that it sounds like, Congressman, you're saying you care about emissions reduction, whereas some of your colleagues may be trying to use the climate issue to push other agendas.
Well, I think again, we have to be able to sustain life in this country and make sure people have jobs. And so I think it's important that, I think that the two things are things that you can't put together. I think in the past, there were some of the groups out there, they just say, no, we're going to stop everything. And that's impossible because again, we've got to have people working and we want to make sure, we maintain the greatest economy in the world, but we can't do that if, like what you see through the Biden administration, what they've been doing recently from the banning on the LNG exports, what they've done with tailpipes, with the emissions there. But when they're in committee before us, that's where you really get into the differences between us. It's not that we're saying that there's not something that's happening out there, but we can do things in the right manner to make sure that we sustain a healthy economy in a healthy environment.
Yeah, and I think just the electric vehicle issue is obviously
Mhm.
top of mind for a lot of people right now. And my old boss, Senator Coburn, who I work for, said the best way to make something expensive is for Washington to make it affordable. And that when Congress gets in the business
Yeah.
of tilting the scales, it has actually the opposite effect of delaying the deployment of technology. And what is your what I hear from you is you're not anti-EV. You're just saying let's let the market figure out
Well, I think,
how to let this technology compete, and
yeah.
what is government's proper role with respect to electric vehicles?
Well, and I think here's what I tell people, and I say this all the time. If you want to drive an internal combustion engine, good for you. If you want to drive an EV, good for you. But the one thing I'm not going to be on the side of is saying that the federal government's going to make that choice for you. Because I've been around here long enough to know, and I've seen it in different things I'm working on right now. If the federal government picks the winners and losers, and this is why I always tell people, we're going to lose. Because the
Mhm.
federal government is terrible at it. Because, it's just like what we've seen with the EVs right now. You put these massive tax incentives out there
Mhm.
and people being able to get these reductions on these vehicles. But then all of a sudden they find out if you live in a northern climate, well, wait a minute, it gets cold, it's hard on the battery.
Right.
And then all of a sudden people say that I've talked to a lot of dealers in our area, people were trading them in within a year of getting them because they said this is not going to work. And so I think it's important that the whole premise of what the administration did was by saying that everything's going to be EV by 2035. Well, the first problem they didn't take into consideration was number one, where are you going to get the power from? Number two, we don't have the transmission lines that we should have to be able to get the power out where you need it. We don't have the charging stations. And then again, people have got to have that confidence level. As time goes by, the batteries are going to get better, everything's going to get better. But at this stage of the game, it's just like for me in my district, I couldn't drive back and forth across my district without the battery dying.
Right.
And so so people like me or if anybody else, and plus the other little factor is these vehicles cost more than an average internal combustion engine. So, again, it's the federal government saying, oh, you're going to be driving this. But it's just like when last fall, when the EPA was before us, I asked a simple question. What's your calculation by 2035 of how much more energy we're going to have just to be able to power the EVs? And he said 4.5. And I said, 4.5 what? He said 4.5%. And I said, that's interesting because we got statistics right now saying 50% more power. And
Right.
so my fear is that why it's so important why you have hearings is that you've got to get these, on the bureaucratic side out and say, look, if you're going to base your premise at 4.5%, you're wrong already. And just recently, in the last week and a half or two, we've seen with the data centers, the numbers that are coming out there, we're going to have a minimum of 4.5% within the next year. It could be 6% by the end of next year, or even up to 8%. So even what the administration was talking about, you've already run by their numbers because that's going to be used up by the data centers. So this is why it's important that that the federal government does not pick the winners and losers, because again, when we're looking at needing more power, not less, that's the other question I ask everybody that comes before us in the Energy Subcommittee. I asked Secretary Granholm that question recently, and everybody has to admit we have to have more power. And
Right.
where's that power going to come from?
Yeah, and significantly more, as you
Yes.
noted, with the data centers and
Yes.
we don't even know what technologies are going to be created that will demand more power.
Absolutely.
Is the unknown issue. Well, on that point, that's a good segue to the next issue I wanted to ask about, is that you've been a leader in making it easier for America to access nuclear fuel. I think in order to have any kind of baseload energy, nuclear is part of the all of the above solution.
Right.
Describe some of your work and leadership in that, and what's been done and what needs to be done in the future.
Well, first of all, you need uranium, and that's my legislation. Because again, if you're going to rely on foreign countries to get your uranium, and unfortunately, the United States has relied very heavily on who? The Russians.
Right.
And it's that, when you look at a piece of legislation that we have out there, it's just like we had TikTok, who are our adversaries, and it's written who our adversaries are. Well, the Russians, the Communist Chinese, the Iranians, the North Koreans. But when you're relying on what I call a source that's not, could be reliable in the future, because all of a sudden they could say, you know what, we're not going to send you any more uranium. That we've got to make sure we're getting it here, that we're processing it here. Because our other problem is, though, when the administration says, well, maybe we need more nuclear, but what do? They close off more federal land out
Right.
west to be able to get the uranium. So this is the problem that we have, and this is why it's important that we have that legislation and making sure that we go forward, that we can move forward with uranium in this country. Because you're absolutely right. We have to have baseload power in this country. A lot of times when we're in committee, I'll ask somebody a very simple question. Could you explain to everybody in the room what the difference between baseload and peaking is?
Hmm.
And that baseload is what turns everything on, keeps things running. In my area of in Ohio, or the state of Ohio, we're part of the PJM area.
Mhm.
I think it's 11 states that are in PJM, but I've asked PJM the same question since 2014, when we had the major polar vortex that came through. I mean, it was cold. But every power station in the state of Ohio, all of our cogeneration plants on the Ohio River, everybody's at max. We did not have a blackout or a brownout in Ohio, and that's my steel production companies, my float glass at that time. Nobody had to shut. You don't shut those lines down. But I've been asking the same question for the last 10 years. Can we sustain that today? And it's always been, yeah, we're fine. Until about a couple of weeks ago, they were in my office. I asked them again, what's the outlook? And they said, well, we think we're okay into 2016. Well, that's not that, you think. And that means we're in bad shape. But if you go to PJM's website, they say right there, we've got it producing more power. And nuclear, if you want carbon-free emission, it's nuclear. And then that's also gets you in the new technologies, from the advanced and the modular, that you can take care of these data centers with a small plant right there, the size of a semi trailer, to make sure that they can produce power for that area.
Yeah, and so the Nuclear Fuel Security Act passed in the National Defense Authorization Act.
Mhm.
And what is the status of the implementation of some of those provisions? Is the Biden administration stalling it, making it difficult? What needs to be done to help move this process along
Well,
so that we're able to access these?
it's always the same thing we always have to do. It's oversight. That's our responsibility, to make sure that when we pass something, that we're moving forward with it. Kathy Morris Rogers' legislation making, banning those imports into the foreseeable future. That's out there. So, but it's what we have to do is bring in the administration folks from from especially the Department of Energy, to make sure that they're implementing the provisions. But again, when we say we've got to do it, but it's the same problem we run into. All of a sudden, you have an administration that is cutting off what we have. The Canadians, and being from where I am in Northwest Ohio, I have a lot of contact with the Canadians, and the Canadians have been out there mapping their entire country into zones, so they know what all critical minerals are out there, and anything that might be there. But the Canadians are our best trading partners. They're our best neighbors right there. And but our problem is that we shouldn't just have to rely on the Canadians to
Right.
get uranium. We should be doing it here, to make sure that we always have that supply to make as we go forward. Because the other thing that I'm a firm believer in, that the French have been doing for years, is recycling those spent
Right.
rods. And they're able, and I've talked to people how much we could get out of it. And there's some talk that we could have almost 100 years of fuel from what we have stored right now from spent rods.
Wow. And how what's the time frame? Let's say we set our minds to the mission of being, let's call it being, nuclear fuel independent or uranium independent, where we're not dependent on any competitor or adversary. Do we have the reserves or the capability of accessing enough uranium within our own country? And or is it the United States plus Canada plus other friends and allies?
Well, that's a good question. I'd have to really check what the overall number would be. Because again, we always, again, we look at the Canadians, because I always say this, that we need to become North American energy independent. I'd say United States, because again, there's like when the president killed Keystone XL, that was 830,000 barrels of oil a day that come into the country. But we have a cross flow with our neighbors north and south. And so it's important that as we look at this, is that we want to make sure that we have what we have to have in this country. But again, it's when you look at what the president did out west recently when they shut down an entire area, it's like,
Right.
and I can't remember how much they thought they could get out of that one reserve area. But the problem is that if everything they do is counterproductive, they say they want to do something and then they cut it off, and it's just like it won't work. And so this is why I always say it's our energy subcommittee hearings are always interesting because just to hear the back and forth is that
Sure.
where this is going to come from, and it's just like we're not going to pull this out of thin air.
Right. Yeah. There's this fantasy that somehow if we decrease supply, we'll decrease demand. But does that work in Ohio, in the Ohio
Oh,
Fifth District?
and it's a good point because I think back. My mom was born on a farm in Northwest Ohio in 1923. She was 12 when they finally got electricity. And when my grandparents passed away in 86 and 89 on the farm, I could probably to this day write down every appliance that were in their home. And you look at what people have today, multiple cell phones, iPads, computers, everything that's running in a house today. That's why I said early on, pardon me, we have to have so much more power out there than ever before. And it's got to be something that people know when they turn that switch on in the morning, it's going to be there. Because I think because again, if you go back to 2008, House Republicans came up with what we called the all of the above energy strategy. And so you looked at all the different things, all the alternatives, but it's all together. But the most important thing again was we weren't going to pick winners and losers. And so you let them market. And it's also interesting to see on committee how quite a few Democrats today are now coming over to nuclear because it's just like, folks, we cannot generate the power without it.
Right. And so, Congressman, as you look ahead to the next Congress, what are some of your priorities and aspirations? I understand that you'd like to be the chair of the Energy and Commerce Committee. What are your areas of focus that you would want to have in that role?
Well, it's a wonderfully diverse. We have the broadest jurisdiction of any committee in Congress. So, again, energy, healthcare, telecommunications. The subcommittee I used to chair, we used to call digital commerce and consumer protection, environment. We have an oversight. But as we're talking about just on the energy side today, we have to be out there making sure we're producing more energy and making sure that we have the right laws in place for those entrepreneurs and innovators to bring it up. When I spoke in Houston a couple of months ago, people from around the world, but they all said the same thing, especially when the president with the LNG export ban. It's just like they said, we want to buy U.S. energy. And it's important for us to always be bringing this up because I can remember the 1970s when we were told two things. We had no oil and we had no natural gas. Well, what are we today? We're the #1 natural gas producers in the world. And we can also outproduce Saudi Arabia or Russia on any given day in oil production. But if we don't have the right laws in place to let them to not only to keep drilling and bringing up the resources, but it's also important because what this administration does, once they start shutting things off, all of a
Right.
sudden what happens? They start laying people off in the fields. The companies that produce the pipe, they have to either scale back, they go out of business, the workers are gone. So we have to have the right laws in place to make sure. And I think it's not only on the oil and natural gas side. We also look at what's happening on the, making sure on the nuclear side as we go, because, you know, when they talk about what we could be doing in advance in the modular,
Hmm.
there's where the technology is for the future for a lot of these
Right.
smaller things that we have to have. So I look at what we have to do with making sure that we take care of ourselves in this country. And as I said earlier, you want to become North American energy independent, that we're never in a situation where you're sending your jobs, your money, or your security over to countries that don't like us.
Hmm.
And so that's one of the things we want to make sure that we're always taking care of, is we have to think about the United States, but at the same time, the United States, you know, not only was the arsenal of democracy in World War II, but it also, you think about today, that we can be out there helping our friends and allies, making sure that they don't have to rely on Russia for their energy needs. Because again, we can help them, and we should be doing that.
Yeah, and of course we've seen the tragedy of what happens when we have bad energy policy with the war in Ukraine. Is that
Absolutely.
Europe made all the same mistakes you just identified with the Biden administration. This idea that if you cut things off, if Germany cuts off its coal plants, its nuclear plants, what they did is, as you know well, they just imported
Yeah.
energy from Russia.
Yeah.
And those CO2 molecules don't ask for a visa when they cross the border. They go everywhere.
Well, you know, bring up an interesting point, because I think it was yesterday, day before, the article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, talking about Germany. And now what are they doing? You know, once they shut down all their nuclear, and they've come back to what? They're burning coal again.
Hmm.
And so, but they've got to have you know, energy being produced in their own country, because it's not reliable when you think about the Russians. And so again, that's why it's important for us to take care of ourselves, but at the same time, we can help a lot of our neighbors out there. I'll never forget, years back, this is started my 15th year on the committee, and I'll be the senior Republican member in the next Congress. But I'll never forget that Joe Barton, who is our chairman emeritus, at the end of a hearing one day, said he'd like a point of personal privilege. And I looked at Joe, and he said, "I just want you to know, I'm looking at my phone right now. The first LNG ship is leaving Texas right now, after
Oh,
they were able to get it done." So, you know, these are the things we can do to make sure that we have what we have to have in this country. But the idea with the administration does is they come up with some, especially again, they're going to release more gasoline up in the Northeast, because why? They got to bring down the price. They got to
right.
bring the price down, because why? They're not allowing drilling. And they've been draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Yeah.
And so what do we have to do? We have to put that back in at a higher cost. And you know, I always tell people, remember, that's for a national emergency. It's
Hmm.
not because you don't have a policy.
It's not a political emergency.
So no, and that doesn't work, but that's what they're using it for.
Right. Well, Congressman, thank you so much for your time. We'll follow these issues
Thank you.
closely and hope to have you back on again soon.
Really appreciate it. Thanks very much.